My name is Kelsey Davenport, and I currently work as the Director for Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. So, for the past 12 years, I focused primarily on nonproliferation. Specifically, I have been looking at options to restrain Iran's nuclear ambitions. Most notably these days, that's included a focus on trying to restore US and Iranian compliance with the 2015 nuclear deal known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And in addition to working on Iran, I also do a lot of work on North Korea, analyzing North Korea's nuclear and missile programs and trying to think through a more effective and creative US diplomatic approach for negotiating a reduction in nuclear risk with North Korea. So those are the two sort of specific countries that I focus on. But I also try to look more broadly at nonproliferation trends writ large, which I think is a really critical issue right now because it appears that we're moving towards a future where more states might view the possession of nuclear weapons or the possession of the necessary capabilities to produce nuclear weapons as necessary for their security. In this so-called environment, states might be, in increasing sort of what we refer to as their nuclear hedging capabilities, under the guise of civilian programs. So I think, in order to head off this future, which would be inherently more destabilizing, we need to look at a better sort of toolkit for preventing nuclear proliferation and, better understand what is driving states to believe that a nuclear hedging strategy is in their security interests. So those are some of the more broad nonproliferation research topics that I'm engaged in right now. That's a tough question because I have a lot of interests. I mean, I always enjoy speaking about the importance of the nuclear deal with Iran because it's something that I've been so heavily invested in throughout my career. But I actually think right now, if I had the opportunity to lecture on anything I wanted, I would talk about why people today should still be concerned about the nuclear threats. I think, when we look at the existential crises facing the world today, climate issues, the energy crisis, issues related to terrorism, the nuclear threat, doesn't always feel as salient. And while the current, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think has, brought nuclear issues kind of back to the surface, many people today, don't feel connected to the nuclear threat. They don't realize that the threat, posed by the possession of nuclear weapons, affects us even at the community level. So, I'd want to look at a lecture talking more about nuclear saliency and talking about just how interconnected nuclear weapons are to issues that we do very much care about, social justice, public health, issues that are really driving a lot more community action right now. So that intersectionality is very interesting to me. I fell into nuclear issues a little bit by accident, like many other people in the fields. When I was at the university, I had the opportunity to intern for a semester in Washington, D.C. with former Senator Richard Lugar. And Senator Lugar was very involved in the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which looked at trying to, secure and dispose of weapons of mass destruction and related materials in sort of the former Soviet states. And that experience really opened my eyes to the threat that nuclear weapons still pose. I mean, prior to that experience, my exposure to nuclear weapons was, I think, probably similar to most others. I knew, of course, of the U.S. use of atomic weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki throughout World War II, the threat posed by nuclear weapons in the Cold War. But past that, I didn't really view nuclear weapons as a current sort of salient threat. And to realize how close we've come to nuclear catastrophe in so many different occasions throughout history, that we still face that threat today, that the threat is rising, was really interesting to me. And it kind of grabbed my attention, and I wanted to learn more about why states view these weapons weapons that, that cause such, humanitarian suffering, that cause such severe consequences on a global scale, why they would view these weapons as necessary for security. So, once I kind of got hooked by Senator Lugar, I think I was reeled in and then realized I wanted to make a career of trying to reduce nuclear risk. So I have a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies and Political Science from Butler University. But I was able to hone my interest in nuclear weapons, more during my master's degree, which is a Master of Arts in Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, the Kroc Institute for Peace Studies specifically. And as part of that program, I actually spent 9 months living and working in Jerusalem in 2010, shortly after the decision was made at the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference that a meeting should be held on establishing a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. So I was actually, in the region, working on this issue. While I think there was still a bit more optimism for progress on establishing such a zone in the Middle East. So that was a great experience. And also, at Notre Dame, I had the opportunity to engage with professors who have, very deep roots in the nuclear disarmament movement. Professors like David Courtwright, George Lopez, who have done, pioneering work on the role of sanctions in preventing proliferation, and, of course, David Courtwright being deeply involved in the nuclear freeze movement. So that was, great exposure, not only to the academic side and some of the arguments about deterrence that drive, state interest in nuclear weapons, but also about the role that civil activism has played in reducing nuclear threats and the role of grassroots movements within the quest for disarmament. So it really was that experience at Notre Dame that helped solidify my interest in a career in this field. Well, any use of nuclear weapons would have catastrophic global consequences for public health, consequences for the environment, consequences for racial justice, in addition to the innocent lives that would be lost. And if we look back over the course of history, the fact that nuclear weapons have not been used since the end of World War II really is quite astonishing. So, I think that we're living on borrowed time, that if we don't dispose of these weapons, eventually, through intentional or inadvertent use, there will be a future nuclear explosion. And again, just given, that such an act will affect, every corner of the globe, every aspect of human life, I think it's very critical that we continue to engage on this issue. And one thing that I think is critical is that it can be easy to look at nuclear disarmament and think, oh, that's impossible. These weapons have existed, for decades. Or, technically, how can we ensure nuclear disarmament? To believe that nuclear disarmament is desirable but not possible. So I think, it's critical that while we talk about the benefits of a world free of nuclear weapons with the public, we also lay out a vision of how to get there. To demonstrate that not only is this a desirable goal, but it's also achievable. Well, there are a lot to choose from, so maybe I'll try to just focus on a few. One thing that I think is really concerning, and I admit I don't work as much on this issue, but in the increased investment in systems that are capable of delivering both nuclear warheads, and conventional warheads. Nuclear armed cruise missiles, for instance, fall into that category. And I just think this trend is inherently destabilizing because it could be so difficult to distinguish between a conventional and a nuclear attack, which I think, invites preemptive nuclear action that would be catastrophic. So that's one trend that I'm worried about. In the space where I work, I'm increasingly concerned that additional states view nuclear weapons as necessary for their security, as necessary to maintain their territorial integrity. And that in the next decade, we're going to see more states develop the capabilities necessary to develop nuclear weapons, if they chose to do so. So I just think that the proliferation trends are moving in the wrong direction. And unfortunately, when we look at some of the states that are the most likely to proliferate in the future, or the most likely to develop these hedges, these are countries that the United States, that Europe have typically had stronger ties with. Countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like South Korea. And so it will be much more difficult to use the typical tools that have been developed to counter proliferation in order to head off any nuclear weapons ambitions. Really is going in the wrong direction, and that's definitely something that worries me.